Well, the quality of my recordings has really gone down quite a bit. I mean, this is sort of probably been created after, or, I mean, to me, it's slightly embarrassing, seemingly to conflate issues which are connected, but which I did not somewhat elaborate, I think, carefully enough. But also that the things that I was seemingly conflating, which I do believe are intrinsically connected, I was doing it in an exasperated tone because I was repeating so many sort of diatribes that I've made on similar topics before, essentially, which is, essentially the nature of seemingly the kind of the corruption of the mob to some degree that which I am starting to get a so I'm going to dig into this issue slightly and hopefully, I mean, more eloquently, hopefully describe what I have been going on and on about these anxious and bashful emotional tones, and how they seem to be part of this kind of, sociologically speaking, that they seem to hold a lot of toxicity within them. That there's a lot of sort of toxic structure, um, which manifest directly because of these emotional tones, and they're part of, all the emotional tones are in some way connected through people to each other. So even if you don't have these emotional tones in your circuitry, you will still have a model of them because you will know someone who uses them, and you will have experience about how they respond and correspond and relate to your circuitry. And so you will have some kind of archetypal, at least, image of them. And so therefore people can use these emotional tones even if they don't directly use them in their own circuitry. And in that way, and in the way in which I think we generally have some awareness and modeling of, you could call them styles of, uh, uh, personality styles, which model to us, certain ways of being and perhaps even metaphysical, characterological kind of structures and mechanisms and devices, which we can, which are part of the kind of mythological narrative, that is in some sense the outward experiential sort of, karmic zoo or something like that, um, which, has its own accounting. We will have our own narrative relative to that objective outside energy authority, which we are, when we interact in that matrix, we become a generic kind of commodity in some sense. And so the actual exchange between that generic flow of energy and all these flows of energy that are occurring around us, structurally, sociologically, and all those sorts of things, um, there is a personal correspondence and a personal relating to that, which is something like, well, someone's individual schema, their internal locus of control, or the abrogation of such, or the lack of development of such, is a style of internal locus of control, sort of being taken by the zeitgeist, being taken along by the perennialism, or whatever. Um, so the reason why I think then these emotional tones are particularly toxic, and they are rajasic emotional tones, um, in what I generally have referred to as the first field circuit. But I mean, these numbers don't are essentially arbitrary. They could be ordered differently. They're just in the table that I constructed. They are they are at the top of the table, and that they are four field circuits, and each of them contain six emotional tones, two from each guna. Okay. And so I think that then people can use these emotional tones even if they themselves don't have them inside their circuitry. And so people can correspond to these emotional tones. And if they do that, I think that they will kind of create a magnetic, to use a scientific metaphor, a kind of a magnetism, a magnetic field, that will, in some sense, peg or pin down an anxious and an emotional, the emotional tones of anxiousness or bashfulness will be kind of like the linchpin of the static or stable sort of field. And I mean, I guess you could describe all emotional tones as being capable of doing that, but specifically the emotional tones that make up anxiousness and bashfulness are the first dimension and the 15th dimension of psychological reality in my model of cognition, which correspond with instinct and exuberance, or extroverted feeling and introverted sensing, or at least a version of those, because there are other versions of introverted sensing in my cognitive model of 17 cognitive functions, and there are also other versions of extroverted feeling. But instinct, or the flesh, or what will be in the prepositional grammatical formulae, in the long form, what will be, the expectation of what will be, the sense of what will be, and what things mean or what things are is exuberance, the introverted sensing. So what will be is a form of extroverted feeling, and what things mean or what things are like or what things are, any thought form that has that contemplative tone in it, any thought form that resonates with the formula of what things are. So what things are and what will be combined. So either you'll have a constructive. I don't have it in front of me, where the one is essentially fixing the other one, or impinging on the other one in a positive atrophied way. So the one cognitive function is forcing the other cognitive function to go along with it, and then you get the other one, the deconstructive one, which will be bashful, where the one cognitive function is displacing and operating in the lack of the other one. So you're actually ignoring one of the cognitive functions and displacing it with the content of another cognitive function. So you actually have one emotional tone that is negating another emotional tone and is, in some sense, suspending the extension of that other emotional tone. And this is actually, so this is very similar to the theory of cognitive axes in Myers-Briggs cognitive functions in terms of the axes theory that was developed around cognitive functions. And so, but my axes look completely differently because they're not correlating to arbitrary ideas that, oh well, in MBTI theory, it's just assumed that basically, well, there are two types of axes. You get the introverted extroverted axis. So introverted thinking will be connected with extroverted thinking on an axis, and then you get the sort of the opposite inflection of the same type. So thinking is a judging cognitive function, so it would go thinking with feeling, and then they would be oppositely charged. So if you were wanting to know what axis extroverted thinking was attached to, it would be attached to introverted thinking, and it would be attached to introverted feeling as a corresponding thing. And so every time, and the point of this is that every time you have an expression of extroverted thinking, according to the MBTI classical axis model, is that it's happening in a way that is it's being pitched at a certain volume, and that volume is essentially it's being broadcast on a spectrum where that plane and that spectrum is essentially is both of those things combined. So essentially, there is no such thing as extroverted thinking according to the classical MBTI. There's only extroverted thinking and introverted thinking. That they come as a joint. They are thinking together. They are just thinking, and then there's also thinking and feeling, which is also a corresponding fundamental conflation. So that these things when they are expressed, they do not exist in isolation. They can only transmit and in some sense as an ontological entity, they share space with these other. So in some sense, there is no such thing as just extroverted thinking. There is only thinking, or there is no such thing as because extroverted thinking is a form of judging in the labeling and the jargon of MBTI. Judging is both thinking and feeling, and perception is intuition and sensing. And so, in the same way that thinking and feeling share an axis in that way, in that conflated paradigm of judging, um, uh, intuition and sensing will also share a paradigm. And so you see, I've broken both of those rules in my more intricate, more intimate, more delicate structure of emotional tones, because here basically I'm saying that specifically the 15th dimension and the first dimension share a cognitive axis, and the 15th dimension is introverted sensing, and the first dimension is extroverted feeling. So I've got a feeling, I've got a sensory function, and I've got a judging function that share the same axis. So that already blows the whole sort of, at least the simplicity of the axis, and apart. And look, it's a decent theory. It's a pretty good approximation. You can do some interesting dynamics with it, and that's why it's cottoned onto, I think, so well, and it's taken off, and it's so successful, is because thinking about it in those kinds of functional dynamics at least gives you a categorical sort of understanding a more informed underpinning, idea about how, there's a kind of more psychodynamic, that there are particular conduits through which the psychodynamic pressures and forces are being channeled through, and it gives you, let's say, an approximate vision of the kind of grooves over which those mechanisms might be operating. And so, it functions quite successfully, but I would argue as an approximate reduction anyway. And then obviously, there's whole levels of complexity on top of that, in that these emotional tones, these which are made up of these cognitive functions, which in some sense will have special axes in both direct correspondence with how one emotional tone can directly impinge on another emotional tone, but also as a secondary form of almost abstract subtraction and other forms of kind of being enculturated into a particular patterned habitual psychological schema in which an individual is going to be particularly bound into uh, and I mean, the kinds of dynamics which I say I should have described more of the dynamics first before putting this heading on it, but essentially that the emotional tones that share the same field circuits are going to directly aggravate each other, or potentially agree with one another. So they can sort of be both a source of getting an ally towards, but in some sense, the deconstructive tones in each field circuit, of which there are always three, will always have one that aggravates another, and another one which will be fundamentally indifferent, except if that indifferent one is going to imagine a kind of habitual drama or a habitual melodrama in which they can imagine how seeing this, let's say, a cognitive function that they're naturally indifferent to in a direct sense, but knowing that will have a knock-on effect, and that will sort of, in the intermediary, will force a kind of indirect imposition. Now it's very interesting because different types of individual circuitry will have the deconstructive tones at, not everyone has many deconstructive tones um, in their personal psychological makeup, but that doesn't even matter anyway, because of what I was saying at the beginning of this recording, is that just because people don't have a direct dog in the fight doesn't mean that they won't have favorites and that they won't even be quite fixated or obsessed on winning their particular favorite, pick of. So I'm trying to think of a gambling metaphor, but I don't know all the proper jargon. But so essentially, and it might also just not even be a lax thing as well. It might be something that they are perhaps even unconsciously reliant on or dependent on, for some kind of psychodynamic necessity or something like that. Or, in some sense, it doesn't need to be out of a direct instinct of self-preservation. In some sense, it might be an indirect necessity because they are used to having a deep sympathy with someone who requires an emotional environment maintained or conserved, in a certain level of melodrama that is necessary for that node in a organizational structure, in a group entity, that they are part of, psychodynamically furnishing with. Anyway, so I'm just basically saying that people can create, let's say, amalgamates. They can, like a serial computer linking itself up, that they can create a shared space, a shared entity within which that their personal dependence of a useful or a comforting and reliable psychodynamic ecology is requires them to anyway. I'm making interesting points as well, but let me just go back to talking about anxiousness and bashfulness. And this is anxiousness and bashfulness. This is the point that I was trying to drive home the whole time. This, I think, is the seal on the envelope. This is what allows people to create a bubble, a cultural bubble. It is what, I've linked it to the notions of duplicity, to the notions of privacy, of the notions of, kind of, oh no, this is personal, and so we use anxiousness and bashfulness to create fences on some level, and some of those fences are not meant to be used, or they don't say, oh no, I have the right to put up this barrier. I have, in some sense, it is the practical thing. I'm just going to duck that problem because I don't want to deal with developing right now. I don't want to grow up right now. I don't want to have to develop my reasoning right now. I've got other priorities. I've got other things to think about, and so I'm just going to use anxiousness and or bashfulness to fob off this issue, and because I've got other priorities that I want to pursue, and I'm not even going to necessarily show you on my sleeve what those priorities are, but I'm just going to de facto instantiate this organizational metric or something like that. And so that is something what anxiousness and bashfulness do. And I do think that there is something about the Anglo-Saxon British political liberal spirit that has actually found a way to safely comport and to contextualize anxiousness and bashfulness within certain limitations so as to not create an insoluble, intractable sort of insulated narrative that is incapable of checking up on its own sort of self-fulfilling, self-spiraling sort of because there's something quite, because of the duplicitous nature that is accessible through anxious and bashful propositioning, or the use of those tones. Because they can, because they use privacy, because they use, oh no, this is personal, so I'm not even going to share it with you, because they give themselves the ability to duck issues because they have other priorities, because essentially because they run roughshod over the issue of trust. And this is exactly what they do within the first field circuit. They do not have any responsibility. They in some sense, they completely duck the issue of trust, which is the 11th dimension of psychological reality. Sorry, it's not the 11th. Which is the 10th dimension of psychological reality, extroverted thinking. They obtusely duck the issue of extroverted thinking. They don't give a shit about extroverted thinking, and they feel more sophisticated when they do so, because the introverted sensing of what things are is, as I've tried to archetypally kind of get into it, is like a private kingdom of God. It is like a private cult. It is like a private sanctum. It is a sanctuary. What things mean to me. And because I can just say what things mean to me, and I don't have to rationalize the trust, or I don't have to, reckon or bring my trust into alignment, because I can just be anxious and bashful about it. I can just subvert the issue of trust completely. And because of that, it's capable of having quite a toxic, self-involuting, kind of insulating, perpetual self-narrative, and this is why, and I believe that these emotional tones, these rajasic emotional tones, are it corresponds exactly with what Sam Vaknin has been recently talking about, in how he's been citing all these papers and things like that speak about how people who use the identity of victimhood and who identify as being a victim, or how they empathize and relate to the world through their status of being a victim, and how they essentially use that in order to kind of virtue signal to some degree, and to create a reality or morality play, and in some sense subvert reality into some kind of ostentatious uh, yeah, I used to talk about this stuff quite a bit when I would talk about borderlines and things like that. But essentially, in some sense, these sort of papers just clearly, in some sense, they lead towards, I would say, the conclusion that borderlines fundamentally are a kind of Machiavellian type, sort of dark triad. Uh, anyway, but anyway, sorry, I was just trying to think of one of the things that I would usually say about borderlines, in terms of how they sort of create a soapbox, and how they try to essentially capture an audience that will then digest and consume, and will be forced to relate to the broadcast of their narrative. So, in some sense, their reality becomes a communicable stream through, but anyway, through which the audience of their reality is essentially roped into being accountable for the consequences and the destinations of their self-reported journeys and things like that. So essentially, they convert reality into a kind of into a broken telephone game, in which their own errors in being able to comport with their very bad reality testing can be used as a kind of fuel for converting their own sort of dysregulated reality testing into somebody else pandering and anyway, so sorry, I've somewhat this thread has. I mean, I can track where I've spoken badly in this thread, but I almost don't want to continue this thread because it just is becoming too fractured. But anyway, what is the important point is that essentially. I mean, also essentially that the use of victim language becomes and talking about being a victim uh, and essentially being able to unilaterally leverage your vulnerable feelings on a certain subject is, I mean, the papers that Sam Vaknin cites directly are linked to how then people are able to essentially extract resources. It's a very useful ploy for people who have essentially dark triad uh, um, characteristics and personality traits. The dark triad being psychopaths, sociopaths, and Machiavellian type personalities. So, and I would say that that is a conspicuous tactic which you can see almost overtly if you have eyes to see it, that plays itself out through people who have anxious and bashful buttons to be imprinted upon, which I've already tried to say come in two varieties. Will be people that have these buttons within themselves and people who have some history of corresponding to them. And I do think that this is why culture can eventually develop a kind of cultural hegemon that can be in the image of essentially a demagogue and the demagogue's following, you know, a kind of a crypt. I do think that it starts off as a kind of crypto-fascism, although for me it's not that cryptic. But essentially, you know, all the identity politics stuff, you know, all the kind of identitarian sympathy mongering and you know, identity consciousness and you know, comparing different lived experiences, you know, in this so that people have a right to their personal pain over the jealousy that their identity has suffered some theft from an expectation that somebody else has an unearned privilege. And so, you know, you have this very disgusting sort of, you know, academically dressed up psychopathology, which is essentially, you know, the broadcast of promoting people towards developing a narcissistic injury and using this common language of what is, I mean, I would even say is a conspicuous um, attempt from probably dark triad individuals have always ideologically used this structure. You know, they have, I think, famously always been dark triad individuals in huge ideological worldviews because they could always use the ideology as a way to entrench and to protect, you know, their uh, sadistically edged use of the narrative in the you know, because when you have a narrative and you have an ideology, you create just the right amount of cognitive dissonance and cherry picked, you know, receptiveness to data, because essentially you've got an ideology which allows you to filter the interpretation of reality so that you can kind of, you end up sort of cherry picking all the things that confirm um, the uh, uh, style of reality testing, which is, you know, sort of uh, which then just must have a kind of an in-group and an out-group, and a kind of conformity of tolerance of a particular signature of, I would even say, is actually described as this emotional of in these emotional terms of anxiousness and bashfulness. The idea is that, well, when we talk about this issue, someone will be bashful about it, and everyone else is meant to have a corresponding anxiousness about not broaching that subject. And it stands as a sacred cow because it's too personal, it's too sensitive to say that no, well, actually, the so called victim in this circumstance is quite much the cause of their own discontent. Uh, I mean, every time I see this played out, it makes me incredibly uneasy when I see people who aren't willing to raise the tempo of ire and to call people out and to actually point out essentially the hypocrisy. And it's interesting because now, you have all these buzzwords. It's amazing how whenever these sort of words come out, they're always immediately repurposed by these dark triad type of crypto-fascists, like gaslighting. That, oh no, if you try to derail someone's ideological worldview, then you're gaslighting them. When you're directly confronting them and directly talking about their ideas head on, but because you're not letting them rely on their narrative, you're not letting them rely on their mythology about their own identity, which essentially must just be allowed to them unquestioningly, uh, and it's quite frankly disgusting. Um, and the weird kind of tolerance of people, which I guess they call it compassion, where it's really a kind of, you know, ideologically entrenched and extracted and parasitic sympathy, which is itself premised and I would say predicated on this kind of self disempowerment that becomes its self fulfilling prophecy, all those sorts of things that I've better articulated in other recordings. But all the inconsistencies and the hypocrisy which is laden within that kind of disgusting position is exactly, I believe, entrenched and insulated because of the anxiousness, bashfulness, sort of cultural hegemon. And when that signature that I'm kind of outlining and pointing out starts becoming, in some sense, this is why I say that British political liberalism had it right, because it had this idea that, and I mean, even in Britain, they have created the same cultural hegemon and the same sacred cow, which is what has allowed the degeneration of integrity in Britain, even in terms of the journalistic integrity. There's no fidelity in journalism because it's completely been captured by this cultural hegemon, which I mean I would say has come directly out of academia. It first came out of academia, it got into journalism, and then the law, courts, and the jurisprudence and the disgusting crypto-fascist, legal positivistic people, they have driven this view of morality which is anti-normative. We essentially don't have any values anymore. We just have this strange narrative about trying to complete the story in order to supposedly assuage some people's broken feelings and their hurt feelings and their scars. And I find it particularly disgusting when people, talk about the South African political situation, and they say, oh, well, many of these politicians themselves, they have scars from the past, and that is why they're doing the kind of policy that they're doing. I mean, this is just, this is such lunacy. The reason why the country is in such a state is because of the electorate. Is for no other reason. The electorate don't deserve a government that is functional when they will vote for corrupt people. And if they want to essentially continue the narrative that allows for the corruption to continue, I mean, it's, if they want to essentially repudiate democracy, which they, in some sense, they have repudiated liberal values. So in some sense, I think that, the whole South African experiment to some degree has, I mean, the only criticism that I would have here is that the opposition parties have for too long not been more vocal in the political arena about underlying the ideological worldview that has entrenched and encapsulated and disguised corruption in its weirdly divisive way. In some sense, journalists have also been a huge part of this, which in some sense, you could make the argument that maybe, well, democracy is destroyed first when the institutions that are meant to prop it up are so hugely corrupt and ideologically captured that, I don't want to let the electorate off the hook, though. I mean, this was the point of the democratic revolution, and in some sense, if we don't bootstrap accountability at some point, then, well, you don't have democracy ever. It never begins, and in some sense, that's almost the premise of the argument, is that, oh no, we just need to find a reset point within history, and we just need to do something in order to assuage these people's feelings that are quite dishonest in their intellectual accounting of essentially the recent history, as if we have an unbroken chain of oppression, of people being oppressed by other people. No. People are oppressing themselves in a democracy. That is what has happened, you could say, over the last 15 years. People have been oppressing themselves, and they want to pass the buck. Well, I'm sorry, but if you want to help create a political, then there does need to be more ire and more, let's say, honest accounting of these things. I mean, that's the only way that you can even start to challenge these corrupt political elites in the first place, is by blaming the people for their complacency, and for allowing the ruling party to be so complacently corrupt. But sorry, I need to sharpen up these points. But yeah, essentially, this whole invention of a racialist dichotomy or some kind of racialist historical filter that does not honestly confront the fact that we have a black majority voting in this country. And you're going to complain that development hasn't happened, but somehow you're not going to blame the government, and you're not going to blame the people who voted for that government. I mean, it's a bit ludicrous. And in some sense, that level of politics which has become normalized, which is a kind of quite a disgusting form of anti-liberal propaganda as well. I mean, effectively repudiates the democratic revolution. I mean, so we have a political establishment or a general political arena that has completely normalized, essentially, the lack of democratic accountability in the electorate. And so you have people who even think, and who even so much as say that essentially, well, it's the blue collar people's fault in some sense, because they keep on voting for or their trade union politics is just completely ineffectual, because it gets it can't effectively impress Labour's real interests on a political level, because there's too much political corruption, basically, and too much political complacency. And who should you blame for that? Well, you should blame the blue-collar worker for that. That would be the only way to wake them up, or to make them more conscious. Well, if you don't like what's going on, vote for someone different. But this weird kind of doublespeak, and this weird kind of dishonesty, and from the people who explicitly say that they want more honesty and they want to talk about the elephants in the room. And the only elephant in the room that they want to talk about is their fucking hurt feelings. I mean, that's fucking retarded. These people are childish. And, essentially, because we can't blame the victim. That's the elephant in the room that we're not allowed to talk about, but we have to somehow talk about unearned privilege. I mean, is it an unearned privilege that you can essentially be taxed disproportionately in the most redistributive, progressive tax regime in the world, effectively? And how much of that money has been squandered? How much of the resources of the state have gone towards making this country essentially incapable of functioning as a liberal democratic success, with a liberal economy that is capable of growth and development? Like, just because we've had 20 years essentially of squandered time in which we could have been developing a growing economy, and because all of that time was essentially wasted, that somehow then we have to talk about the issue of identity politics, justice for the youth, for the young, poor black youth who are approximately poor for what reason? Not because of apartheid, not because of colonialism, but because of the lack of development and the lack of growth in the economy over 20 years. So because there is no social mobility, now we have to talk more about redistribution at a time in which we essentially don't have, we have a tax base which is essentially, in the process of leaving the country, or to a large extent has been dwindled because of the failure of the economy in general, but also because of the general political signals of more overt political corruption and gross violations of rights, essentially of property rights, which you can't have a modern functioning economy without such. So you just have more lunatic, craven corruption and ideological misanthropy, in some sense, that gets to redirect all the problems of no democratic accountability, no democratic, I mean, the lack of values-based, principled thinking, just so that you can talk about your feelings about history that you weren't even fucking alive for. Oh, okay, so your parents had bad experiences. Well, a lot of your parents' bad experiences were also created by a black government that was corrupt and failed to deliver. And that failed to deliver the promise of a brighter future, of class mobility, of quality education. And instead, who do we take the side of? We take the side of the teachers' unions instead. And we want to go again to business and to try to destroy it even more, when business should be more vulnerable to small business that is capable of growing and developing a country. But instead of creating a climate in which you can actually have small businesses that are actually vibrant and absorbing labor and dynamically creating skills, which essentially you can't do in this modern climate because of the racial politics, because your black professional staff will be headhunted. They won't be able to develop skills with you retaining that labor. So because of the huge premium, because of the ideological racial accounting that is imposed and mandated by government. Well, at the same time, the kind of the crazy tax. It's such an inhospitable environment on all sides, and instead of actually having an organically grown labor market, which would also allow people to humanize one another, but as soon as you've got racial identity consciousness as part of the actual law itself, I mean, you've just created a toxic mess in which people will only breed resentment as everything fails and functions at a lower rate. And so the cost of life goes up when, in some sense, people are always demanding more money and increases, when in some sense the cost of living should go down, but it never does, because essentially everything is being burned from both ends. But yeah, the idea that you're just going to sort of like create identity justice as well, you know, sorry, I'm somewhat responding to a woman who was, you know, part of a roundtable sort of discussion, who made so many disgustingly crypto-fascist, you know, policy points, demanding that we need strong leaders and um, we need bargaining that is capable of having sanctions on people and things like that. Like, big businesses should not have the breathing room to be able to make certain commitments like that. They are only able to do that because they are basically protected from all of this red tape and this, which is why we have no small businesses, essentially. Big businesses should not have the room to be able to make that kind of bargaining and to make those kinds of sanctions, because this is why we live in a failing economy, essentially. And we can't even help small business, because if we did, then politicians wouldn't be able to extort these big businesses for, you know, these kinds of these token identity politics programs and mandates. And so you've got essentially an unworkable situation, because we've got a kind of solution that comes from identity politics, which demands that the structure of the economy must be inefficient, must be essentially monopolies, or at least protected cartels and licensed, you know, sort of big players, because only big players have the space and the capacity to absorb this kind of, you know, slash and burn, hollowing out of any kind of organic, fluid, you know, actual productive, you know, efficient use of an allocation of resources and labor. So you never actually have an authentic burgeoning economy that is actually being able to offer more for less, and which increases everyone's quality of life, because, you know, you actually have accelerating productivity. Instead, you force people to have to engage in lowering their productivity by engaging in, you know, weird token identity politics, you know, types of piecemeal issues, which are, you know, you can have some enlightened governmental intervention, but it has to be, in some sense, on the demand side, not on mandating the supply of something. Um, when I say demand, I mean on the level of the market, that they essentially that they wouldn't mandate that people have to have a certain quota in terms of so they wouldn't mandate certain uh, uh, market relations that demand things from the market. They would try to promote the supply to the market. So if there wasn't enough, uh, um, if people couldn't get the skills in order to enter a profession, then you would uh, create incentives, or you would create subsidies that would promote the supply of it. So essentially, if a if you know, which would be essentially like bursaries, essentially. So you would have some kind of government sponsored bursary, and so essentially, if a company was interested in having in choosing to get into developmental policy, then they could take the government up on an open door policy, in which that the government would actually be funding subsidies for bursaries for a particular post or something like that. So government would actually be doing something on the supply side. It wouldn't be mandating demands. That would be how you would actually then have everyone functioning in good faith, everyone functioning as a, and then you would be able to see the companies that actually want to do it. But the reason why it has to be government subsidized is because you don't want to mess with the market. Because if you say, well, actually, if you do this kind of policy, we're going to give you a tax break or something like that, then you're picking winners and losers within the market, and you're going to have essentially, well, you're going to have the room for corruption as well. So if you do it on the supply side and not on and mandating demand from the market, then actually your government policies, you can actually see how many people are using them. You can actually see how effective they are. You can have some kind of measurement attached to them, and you can also essentially allow smaller competitors to still be able to establish themselves and to be part of the market, because you're not going to have these big players that suddenly get a huge boon by having an unwieldy kind of government dispensation, which will somehow will find its way in terms of, you know, picking winners and picking losers, which disrupt the market and the fluid development of a functioning market. And so, you know, the kinds of justice, social justice, or the kinds of hurt feelings that want to be contended with, I mean, in some sense, you know, it's so disgusting, because essentially what that call comes out to is, you know, people have scars from the past. Well, I mean, if you follow that analogy, that, well, then how would you even, how can you fix a scar? I mean, the only way to fix a scar is cosmetic surgery. Is that what you want from your strong moral leadership? Is that you want them to offer cosmetic surgery out to people in order to assuage their feelings, which are fundamentally intractable, and I would even argue are fundamentally entrenched in the scars of the dark triad, in the scars of Machiavellianism, sociopathy, and psychopathy. That's what these people are. They are closet. I mean, you know, Sam Vaknin used to call them essentially, you know, all these people who are supposedly empaths. He used to call them covert narcissists. Now he says, no, actually, if you follow this paper, you actually have to say that these people are directly part of the dark triad. They are overtly Machiavellian at the very least, if not also psychopathic. So that's what we have dealing with normalized in politics. We have a slew of people who have been able to normalize their psychopathy, and by hijacking moral language and talk about being a victim and talk about their history and their fucking identity. These crypto-fascists, miscreants, these evil people who just want to indulge in their activism. You know, oh, listen to the youth. Listen to the youth talk about what? About other people's unearned privilege. I mean, this is such a selectively ostrich head in the sand kind of worldview. I mean, and in some sense, I think that it all exists within the envelope, which is sealed essentially with this anxious and bashful structure and template in some sense. And essentially because it's used as a bulwark against essentially issues of trust and actually having extroverted thinking about these issues. Anyway, but I do think that in the way in which, I mean, there probably is a more structured pattern about how the anxiousness or bashfulness, or perhaps a combination of both, correlate to averting angry and what's the other one? Because in some sense maybe they link anger directly to bashfulness or anxiousness, or they have a melodrama that sort of comports angry emotion, the angry emotional tone. It is sort of it steals it into its vortex, into its insulated narrative. And what was the what is the Satvaik? Is confused. They don't allow for confusion. Essentially, they believe that the emotional tone of confused is just is essentially, no, you can be certain about it in terms of the insulated, anxious and bashful narrative. There's nothing to be confused about ever. Essentially, there's nothing to piece around with extroverted thinking. Yeah, so they live in a world in which confused emotional tones are just people who haven't picked an envelope. They haven't picked a faction. They haven't picked their part in the narrative or something like that, and they just okay. But the other point about this is that uh, yeah. So I mean, I wonder if that is also just a general solution to these crypto fascists, is that you point out the missing, confused question that is being obviated, that is being sort of just completely nullified, and and in some sense, you just kind of go through the actual process of being confused about something and actually reconciling with that confused frame of reference, which will, in some sense, allow you to to bypass through their train of thought and show it to be quite lackluster and to be quite deficient and in some sense overtly dishonest, I would even argue as well. Um, but so anyway, but it's weird because in some sense, to do it neatly, you would have to actually not be angry, because in some sense, as soon as you show any anger, then they will try to kind of use it to sort of uh, to play off their bashfulness, which is weird because in some sense, yeah, I mean, or it's their bashful, anxious, sort of two-faced, forked tongue, kind of disposition, which they use to kind of grate down everything into their simplistic narrative. Um, anyway, what was the point that I was going to make about this? Is that the emotional tones. I was just going to speculate as to that perhaps then it's a they have, what makes them the cultural hegemon is that they've found a way to kind of conflate angry and anxiousness, so that when they use the anxious emotional tone, it's automatically assumed that if you're anxious about something, you can also be angry about it. And because of that, they found a way to bypass being confused about anything. Therefore, they can just be bashful and fake it until they make it, until their narrative gets served, or until their narrative seems to win out, because they just keep on table thumping their narrative, and they say, "Oh yes, I'm up for compromise. I'm up for compromise," but the compromise is essentially just them waiting for a more opportune time. Um, to table thump the narrative again, which they say, "Oh, we're compromising because we're willing to go along with it until we get the 51% and the legal positivism and the corruption of the legal tradition and the legal system, so that we can just do whatever we want as soon as we get 51%, and we'll just keep on demoralizing everyone and playing our narrative games and things like that until we force people to put up with our insulated feelings." Um, as they are essentially never allowed to be confused about themselves, because they have this private national or ethno-national, kind of identitarian, or they have this private morality essentially, which doesn't ever have to comport with extroverted thinking, with trust. And it's quite, obviously it's open for corruption, because when you have a worldview that essentially doesn't have extroverted thinking or doesn't have trust as one of its main components, because trust becomes automatic with whoever is representing the narrative, the giant, sort of worldview and train of thought. Um, So it's just be on the right side of this train that is definitely coming either way, and you call that train something like the savior of the identity, the Führer of the system. Um, and so yeah, it's just this idea. It's weird because I do think that they have in some sense displaced confused, that somehow, because the idea of being confused is that there is a hope of a resolution, but in some sense they've kind of removed confused from the pantheon of possibility. And so if you're bashful about something, it means that essentially, well, there's something that needs to develop. That is, I guess, the bashful way, is that no, we're not ready to we have to do another priority first, and then we'll come back and we'll do it all in our own time, or something like that. Again, this is why I like the British political liberal ethos, is because in some sense it put very strict limits on that sensibility of bashful and anxious tones, that you couldn't just, well, yeah, if you wanted to be bashful and anxious, then go home and don't get out of the kitchen, as it were. If like if you're having a personal problem, then go to a personal space and have a personal problem. Don't have it in the middle of the public square. Don't have it in the middle of public debate or something like that. Like there's a place and a time for everything. Go and do other things. um and like, don't don't try to get therapy from politics. Don't try to get your personal private therapy out of politics. um don't invent a whole decrepit, corrupt form of politics just because you need therapy. Or in some sense, I would say that that's not overtly what's happening. These people they don't want therapy. They are psychopaths, and they are simply using their emotional victim status essentially to feign, the morality play, to in order to allow them to access and extract parasitism and resources in an unaccountable way. And they are not being held to account, because people are essentially, they buy the cultural hegemon in some sense, or at least the journalists are fundamentally, they are in on the dark triad. They are sociopaths themselves. They like that kind of social manipulation. It's probably why a lot of them became journalists, because they like being the mouthpiece and the broadcast, and they like rubbing shoulders with the people in the corridors of power, and they like essentially being judges over these things. They like having important opinions about these things. And for them, it's more important to be on the right side of the cultural hegemon than to speak the truth, essentially, because for them, the truth is always self empowering or some disgusting thing like that. And it comports to this identarian, ideological, crypto fascist, cesspool and snake pit, which it is. Anyway, as they continue to demand for bad structures that allow them to continue their armchair, judgment over society, so that they can continue to parasitically extract, using their ideology and their so-called, misuse of what they characterize as social justice. Um, anyway, okay, I'm just sort of repeating myself, but I do think we've somewhat culturally been taken over by people who have an ideology which assisted them in their sort of dark triad victimology. And this is why the leaders of these activist movements, are these very ignorant, young, often queer people who are fundamentally, misanthropic, essentially, looking for some blame in order to be the conduit of essentially the solution to everything. Keep on doubling down and externalizing blame and owning none of it and being part of the activism as a self-soothing. It's politics is therapy. How decadent can you be? How fundamentally corrupt can you be in some sense? It's and it's obvious what the general sort of outcome of this stuff is. It's overt fascism eventually. You end up burning up actual normative values, actual morality, after chasing this dragon of this mythical justice and this mythical morality of strong leadership, which keeps them being demanded by all these disgusting crypto-fascists and their cohort. I would just call them proto-fascist, essentially, but they are overtly proto-fascist. To me, it really irks me how they dress up their language in moral speak, and just how hollow and the kind of legal positivism that it's fundamentally entrenched in, but also the moral conflations that are all over the place and the kind of selective historical reading. But also, in some sense, the overt lack of imagination, that somehow, it's always business's fault for not being like a benevolent government, like as if business is meant to be like a benevolent government. We live in the most sort of disgusting and weird setup where essentially the government is expected to displace the market, and the market is expected to fulfill the role of government. They've completely reversed the roles of the public and the private sector. It's utterly unsustainable. And if you wanted to have a basic income grant, which I also think would also be politically problematic, because not for the politics. I mean for people themselves. It would make people even worse, and it would perversely incentivize them to have even more disgusting politics, essentially. But if we had poverty under control because of the growth of a liberal economic market economy, then we wouldn't need to even be talking about having a basic income grant, essentially, because there would be enough jobs and things like that. But the idea that you can supplement, if you're going to give a basic income grant, you would have to essentially, I would say that responsibly, you would have to stop all government services, so that you would just give money to the people directly. It would at least then cut down on corruption, and then you would at least give a space for the economy to grow, essentially. And then, but essentially that would be one way to pay for it as well. But then you would find that, it's not easy to get everything that you want, because you actually need entrepreneurs. You actually need people who actually know how to run a business successfully. You actually need people with skills to administer things. And if you intelligently cut enough government red tape, then you would perhaps and had the right structures in order to try to help bring down, for example, the cost of healthcare and things like that, and have an actual functioning market in competing over those services. You probably end up with also much better capacity and delivery to people, and perhaps they would have some capacity to buy those things with the basic income grant. But the problem would be is that I think the basic income grant would be worth very little very quickly. Whatever rate you put it at, I think it wouldn't. That's what happens every time they've increased the minimum wage. It's just driven inflation insanely. So the idea that a basic income grant is not going to be immune to the same measure that you create in terms of minimum wage, I think, is a bit strange. But also, the fact is that most people that need a basic income grant probably need a lot more help than access to money. They probably need some kind of entrenched parental functionary over them. They need a government program or something like that. what I'm specifically talking about is people that are into drugs and alcohol and self-destructive, but also they could use that money to be destructive to people around them. And I actually think that that is not going to be an insignificant proportion of the population in this country. And that in some sense you might also create horrible perverse incentives that will create an escalating political demand for more free something, you know, and essentially we can't afford it. It's not sustainable, but also that you might, in some sense, literally perversely incentivize very, we could only argue, as morally corrupt adaptations to a basic income grant. People farming children, for instance, people trying to turn children into a way to extract funds from the state. Things like that, which sadly in this country I think you couldn't put that beyond. So the amount of moral hazard that you would create with the basic income grant, but also that in some sense it is to try to put out the fire in the wrong place in some sense. I mean, as a triage, it might be a useful idea in some kind of interim, but if it's going to be used as a general sort of solution without fixing the major structural problems that, in some sense, if you fix those major structural problems, you wouldn't need a basic income grant in the first place. So, in some sense, and because of the moral hazard issues, it is hugely problematic, I would say. I mean, it's so simplistic that it seems like it's the solution to everything. But if it was actually implemented, we would probably see that over the medium course, I don't think we would even get to the long term, because I think by that time the whole society and civilization might have essentially collapsed because of it. That seems like a hugely radical claim to make, but I think that without without proper education, without proper developmental, transformative-minded policy, you know, in the current climate, in the current state of politics, it would be a slippery slope to overt fascism overnight, essentially, because playing with that tool, with that mechanism, while at the same time accelerating the spiral and the collapse of everything. I mean, in some sense, I mean, this is going to, I guess, seem heartless, but at the point at which that, you know, the youth have 60% unemployment, those kinds of statistics. Well, if you know, they need to vote towards getting jobs. They need to channel their vote towards actually doing something that will structurally and sustainably allow for there to be a hopeful future in this country. If they're not willing to cotton on and be aware of enough politics, of enough economics, of you know, if they still want to essentially use identity politics as an excuse to coast through life in an ideology and a worldview which is utterly irresponsible and unaccountable to any kind of reason or pragmatism or reality, simply because it's a fashionable buzzword, and because journalists and some academics who are essentially all a lot of dark triad crypto-fascists, and because, you know, their whole generation has been indoctrinated into this normalized political fascism, essentially. Well, I mean, if that is going to be the way that they want to go, then you know, nothing's going to stop them anyway. And a basic income grant is really just going to vindicate the point that that is the way that you solve these problems, or something like that. And you know, as soon as you have that kind of tool of overt redistribution, that is not designed to be a triage, but is designed to be like, well, I mean, I guess it's styled as a basic human right or something like that, to have a basic income. But the degree to which that it just doesn't function morally on the individual scale is a fundamental problem that has to be solved before you implement it. If you could have a moral standard and a moral test to receive the income grant, I would be fine with that, but you would never be able to do that. You couldn't do that in a liberal democracy, or at least I don't believe you could. You can't say, no, no, you have the wrong morality. We're not going to give you a basic income grant because you're a destructive human being, or you are morally doing something which is fundamentally perverse, because you are trying to have so many children so that you can inflate your basic income grant on behalf of all of these children, which you're not properly or responsibly looking after. If you put in those kinds of checks and balances and standards or something like that, or if you said, well, actually, we don't want to subsidize your lifestyle because your lifestyle is just not good enough to bring more children into this world and to subvert them and to subject them to that kind of denigrating way of life or something like that. I mean, it's fundamentally unworkable. You could have something like that if you had a very high level of education in a system. If you had a society that actually had a world-class, first-class education system in which, everyone was essentially guaranteed to become a productive member of society going through that education system, and it had enough fundamental internal rigor and capacity in order to assuage and to help parents become better parents in helping their children develop and grow, or taking over from parents that couldn't fulfill that kind of, let's say, necessary duty in terms of the next generation. If we already had an education system that was capable of doing that, then we could add a basic income grant on top of it. But until we get education right, you can't do these experimental things. Also not under the current political arena, essentially. But in some sense, I think that it's somewhat an intractable problem. Also because, the disassociation of income and some kind of moral or ethical stance in life, but also how you position, in some sense, in a market, money is a signal. If you don't have money, that means you haven't garnered the right skills. You haven't chosen the right path in life. That's what money is supposed to mean in a market economy. Obviously, we don't have a functioning market economy because we have a corrupt government that gives corrupt policy and racialist policy that has destroyed everything. So, everything is working in reverse. We have a shrinking economy when we should have a growing economy, and we have missed out on growth for about 15 years because we have a complacent governmental, corrupt class that is completely unchallenged and which is given cover by these disgusting crypto-fascists that tell us all the time about unearned privilege. How ironic is that? What about the unearned ideological privilege of your disgusting ostrich in the sand, head in the sand worldview? You just close your eyes every time. Close your eyes and talk about the hurt feelings and the scars of history. What about the scars of recent history over the last 15 years? You racist people, you disgusting racists that are destroying this country with your disgusting racism. And your journalistic friends and your academic friends and all the crypto-fascist lot of you that should be in jail for constitutional damages for spreading anti-constitutional propaganda and undermining the value of non-racialism, and undermining the values of a liberal democracy because it doesn't fit into your disgusting racialist worldview, because you're a disgusting fucking racist. That's the lot of you. And you deserve to have a banana republic in a failed state. If only we could partition this country into people that would actually support the real constitution and people who want to have the identity politics and the identity consciousness reinterpreted, betrayed constitution. You can have your fake New South Africa that you stabbed in the back and that you betrayed with your disgusting racialist, neo-apartheid, proto-fascist bullshit. You can go and have your banana republic and go have at it. You can even, go have half the country, please, and go make a wonderful failure about it, because that's what you are in ideological terms. That's exactly what you are. You're a mess, and you deserve to be a mess, and you've supported the mess that this country is in because you never wanted reconciliation all you wanted was essentially some kind of revenge, some kind of collective dark triad, Machiavellian, racialist melodrama. Oh, and the scars of your history. Well, if you have scars, I guess, should we really talk about scars? I mean, let's think about your metaphor for a second. How fucking good is it to talk about a scar? Do you want cosmetic surgery? You want a strong leader with strong moral fortitude to give you cosmetic surgery for half the population. Well, cosmetic surgery is an elective type of surgery. It's not efficient. It's not useful. And if we're going to spend all our money on elective surgeries that are fundamentally cosmetic, we're going to have no money to actually fix the real fucking problems in this country, which you want to be fixed by going after business that has already essentially been thrown under the bus. When we should be opening up the economy and making it fluid and organic and growing so that small business can function. But no, you want your identity politics ransom, which can only be paid by big players, by cartels, by monopolies that own government licenses, because everything has been locked down and everything is controlled by government. Because that is your vision of social justice, is having big business in collusion with big politics and big strongman politics, giving out token to some token group of people. And when does that tokenism ever end? And when does it ever become an authentic, functioning economy? Never, basically. It just is just more diversion and disguised corruption so that you can have your ideological privilege as you complain about other people's unearned privilege. How fucking ironic can you get? But that's what happens when you live in a country that's infested with crypto-fascists that have been normalized because of the winds of identity politics that come to us from the noxious and the disgusting American legal system and American jurisprudence with their failed legal tradition that we have imported now in this country so that we have a governmental privilege, so that a governmental prerogative that is allowed to create this disgusting racialist anti-constitutional legislation that has completely decimated the country. And has done so for at least 15 years now, and has gone unchallenged because of the corrupt legal tradition that has now been completely corrupted so that it can even facilitate expropriation without compensation, because that is how disgustingly racist everything has become and how it's become normalized, essentially, by these people who still want more. They still want more of a token given to their identity because they want the scar of their identity, which is a fictitious entity, the black identity. That's what it's all about. In an ethno-nationalism that has now become the center of even when they want to talk about social compacts, that's all they want to talk about. Anyway, yeah. So everything is insoluble because these people are bashful and anxious, essentially, about their identity. And that gets to trump everything else. I mean, it's not to say that you can't be anxious and bashful, but you should also be anxious and bashful and confused and sad and lonely and angry. And that's the fucking human condition. All of those things. And, get some sort of self-awareness, I guess. But then they'll say, oh, well, you can only say that because you have unearned privilege or something like that. People that know nothing about me or my life or whatever, these people who have cushy jobs on a sinking Titanic, essentially, because they are so up their own arse. Anyway, I guess this has been a very angry rant, but yeah, I should start the next topic on another recording.